If you've ever done suspension work on a Subaru, especially if it's from the Rust Belt, you'll know that it can be brutal. Everything basically feels like it's welded together and doesn't want to come apart. So today I'm going to talk about some interesting specialty tools that can really help you get the job done, especially for the home, DIY person. None of these is going to be insanely expensive, and they're really going to be almost impossible to get the job done without in some cases. So let's take a look. If I miss any tools here, make sure to let me know in the comments, because I always want to know if there are, nice specialty tools that I need to buy out there. But first things first, you can assume that you're going to run into a lot of really stuck nuts and bolts here. So in most cases, you're going to want to hose down with a good penetrating oil. I like to use PB Blaster. Just make sure you keep it off any rubber boots, because this can really shorten the life of things like CV boots and the little boots on your ball joints. And then you're gonna, again, assuming things are gonna be super stuck, make sure you have a good breaker bar. I think this one's a 2-footer. It gets pretty much everything done under there. If you need more than that, you're probably gonna be snapping bolts off. And then a good 1/2-inch impact. If you have an air compressor, air impacts are a good value, but these modern electric impacts are awesome, but they're not cheap. This Thor is a beast. So check this out, good air impact. Everything on here, I'll put a link in the comments too. So now let's start to get into stuff that you probably don't have on your shelf, but you're gonna wanna buy before getting into a project like this, just so you're not out of commission for too long. So one thing that's going to give you all kinds of trouble is going to be separating the ball joint from the lower control arms. So you really want a good ball joint separator. So this is I think this is from Gear Wrench. Basically, you can put it on your control arm, crank this down, pushes up on the threaded stud on the bottom of the ball joint and splits it. I've also had good luck using a monster spud bar to get between the control arm and the steering knuckle to split the ball joint out from the lower control arm. This one is like 5 feet long, and even still it is really tough to get that separated. Once you get to the point where you actually want to remove the ball joint, which most people are going to tell you, just flat out don't even think about removing a Subaru ball joint from a steering knuckle unless you absolutely have to, because these things are nightmares. But after fighting for honestly like a day trying to get this off, I finally ended up buying this Astro Tools ball joint puller. So basically you thread this into the threads on the bottom of the ball joint after you've already got your control arm off, and put an air impact on this and just go nuts on it. And honestly, mine was so stuck, I was pretty concerned I was gonna split the ball joint in half before it ever came out. It did luckily come out anytime I've had to do it, but holy smokes, like honestly be prepared to buy a whole steering knuckle, because Subaru stuff gets so fused together. I'll mention this because most of us don't have sockets this big, but on the end of your CV axle, if you have to take that nut off, say you're doing a wheel bearing or something, you're going to need 1.25 inch giant socket. And there's a metric, I don't know what the metric size is, 34, 36 millimeters or something. It's basically one of those metric sizes where there's an inch overlap, so this works good. Another thing that's going to be pretty helpful for a lot of suspension jobs is going to be a pretty powerful air hammer. You're going to really want a long stroke. So these come in a short stroke and a long stroke. The long stroke's going to have a lot more just brute force. And the one thing I use these for is the Subaru hub and wheel bearing, which gets completely fused to the steering knuckle to the point where, again, you really feel like you're going to break something. And ideally, you can use a blunt force attachment like this and basically just hammer on the side of the wheel bearing and hub assembly until it starts to rotate and basically breaks loose that galvanic corrosion bond or that rust bond that you're dealing with. So that's in an ideal world, but all of you that live in the Rust Belt know even then it's really difficult sometimes. So that's when these chisels are going to come in handy, and they're probably going to tell you not to do this, and there is some risk of damaging your steering knuckle. So go into it knowing that, but you can basically wedge this between the steering knuckle and that hub assembly and start to pull it kind of out and then kind of work on the other side and go back and forth. And it's really the only way I've been able to get these things out because they just get fused in place. This is an Ingersoll Rand. Let's see what the model number is. It is a super beast. It's a 119 Max. So this thing is awesome. It uses a lot of air though. So if you've got a small air compressor, it's going to be working it and you're going to have to kind of take a break once in a while. There is a tool to break free a wheel hub for Subarus. I've never used it, but I've heard nothing but good things about it. You basically slam it with a sledgehammer. I mean, if you've used it, make sure to let me know how good it works. My only maybe fear of it is I just don't want to bang on my suspension that hard. The full-size sledgehammer, because I'm afraid I might damage like a ball joint or something, or a wheel bearing, which I guess you're replacing, so it doesn't matter in this case. But that's an interesting tool. I just like to give an honorable mention. Another thing you'll find to be really handy is a good slide hammer. I think this is like a 4-pound. It's pretty beastly, and you thread all kinds of different attachments on here. This little hook comes in handy. I've used this hook to get a CV axle out of the front differential. You can basically use a pry bar, like something like this, to get it started, but even still it'll stick a little bit. So this will kind of help you hook it and pull it out. They actually make a nice little hook attachment specifically for pulling out CV axles, so I'll show you that as well. Another thing you can do, and this is sometimes wishful thinking, but talking about the wheel bearing and hub getting stuck, you can use these attachments, use the slide hammer and just horse on it like crazy, and you might get it out. I would say it's like 50-50 if that's going to work. If you're not in the Rust Belt, you got a much better chance. And the other thing that can happen is the end of the CV axle can get stuck in the wheel bearing assembly, the wheel bearing and hub assembly. So you can use one of these, basically put some nuts on it, you find the right one for your pattern, and then thread this and push that splined shaft out of the wheel bearing assembly. So these are things where you don't necessarily know if you're going to need them. Oftentimes I can get away without using the slide hammer. So you can see it doesn't have a lot of wear, but when you need it, it's the tool for the job, and they don't cost a ton. This is about 80 bucks, and it comes with all kinds of stuff. The pullers, in addition to the slide hammer stuff. And it's a gear wrench, and I generally like stuff from Gear Wrench. It seems to hold up pretty good. It's usually a pretty good value. A lot of times you'll find yourself in tight corners where you just can't get your wrench in where you need it, or you can't use an impact when you wish you could. So these universal joints are just so helpful. It's nice to have impact grade, a 1/2 inch, even a couple, and a 3/8 inch drive. These get used a lot, along with lots of little extensions and things. You never know what kind of corners you're going to be working in under a car. Now things like sway bar end links, you just really can't get them off. There's a little Allen key that you're supposed to put in while you break it loose, but that just becomes completely rusted and impossible to work with. So you're going to probably have to cut them off. So a good angle grinder with a cutoff wheel is pretty handy. You could use a little cutoff wheel on like a die grinder. I really don't like these, mainly because my air compressor just is not fit for the job. These use a ton of air, not a lot of torque either. So on an angle grinder, that usually does the trick. And then last but not least, a good torque wrench, because when you're working on suspension components, you really don't want them coming loose on you. So you want to be torquing those to the proper torque specs. I will mention I often use anti-seize to, you know, make my future life slightly better. When you're using a torque spec and anti-seize, you're going to want to lower the torque. Anti-seize will tell you usually about 25%. And the reason is because you've now lubricated those threads. So you're achieving basically, you're reducing the friction necessary to turn it. So you're achieving kind of that same clamp force with a little bit less torque. And if you don't do that, you do risk either, you know, stretching the bolts or more likely snapping them. So just keep that in mind when you're using anti-seize. I think that pretty much covers it for my specialty Subaru tools. Again, if you've got any other ideas, mention them in the comments, and make sure to click subscribe below if you like videos like this. Thanks for watching.